Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking you through Booktube's 100 best novels of all time. So, some of you may remember that a few months ago, The Guardian published a list of the 100 best novels of all time. This list was created by surveying, I think it was like 170 or something, critics and academics and writers, novelists, who all submitted their 10 best novels of all time, and The Guardian compiled it into a list. And I made a video on this channel going through that list, as did many other booktubers on their channels. And one thing that I thought might be interesting to do after that list was to create a Booktube version of that list, to survey people who watch Booktube and find out what they thought the 10 best novels of all time were, and to pull that together into a list. So I did a survey asking people who watch Booktube, you know, what do you think are the 10 best novels of all time? And I went through all the data, which took a really long time, hence why I'm not making this video until about 6 weeks after the survey closed. But I've been through all the data and I've come back to you with a list of what Booktube thinks are the 100 best novels of all time. I'm going to go through the list today, but before I do, I have a lot of preamble and stuff I want to discuss before we get into the list itself. I found this a really interesting exercise and I found it really interesting to put the list together. I think there are a lot of good books on the list. I do think there are some biases within the list, which we'll talk about in a minute, but I think it's an interesting list, and it's been quite an interesting process to do the survey and look at all the data. So 508 people replied to the survey, and across those 508 people I had 1,268 novels nominated, as top 10 novels. I did also have an honourable mention section, but I didn't use that in creating this list. Today I'm going to go through the books that made the top 100, but I am also going to make another video, which will hopefully be up next week, maybe further down the line, but I'm going to make a video talking about some of the honourable mentions and the books that didn't quite make the list, the authors whose votes were really spread out, and because, you know, there were some authors who got quite a lot of votes that spread out across quite a few books. There are also some books nominated that didn't make the list but that I personally think are really fantastic that I want to kind of just give a shout out to, and I will also try and talk about the books that got the most honourable mentions in the sort of honourable mentions category I left, if I manage to sort through all that data in time. Some people left 2 honourable mentions and some people left 50. I didn't give a limit, so that data is just taking a little bit of time to sort through. But anyway, some overall thoughts from the list. The first thing I wanted to say is that this list of the 100 best books of all time is from a survey. This is not my personal opinion. I have created this list in the sense that I have pulled the data together from the survey, but I have not curated this list. Quite a lot of these books I have read, but some of these books I haven't read and I don't know that much about. And you may notice that throughout this video I put best books in air quotes, because what is the best book of all time? What does that even mean? What counts as a good book anyway? Individual people's definition of what is the best book would really differ. So, you know, take this list with a pinch of salt, as you should take all of these lists. One other thing to say, a few people specifically requested that I exclude multiple books by the same author, and I have purposely not done so, because the whole point of this experiment, for me, was to create a list in the same way that The Guardian created their list, by gathering lots of people's 10 best books of all time and then pulling it together in one big thing. The point was to create a list in the same way that The Guardian did, but with a different sample of people, a different sample of readers, rather than changing the criteria. When it is a list created from a survey, not from a created list by one person, then it seems wrong to exclude a book that got more votes than another book just because there's another book by that author already on the list. So there are quite a lot of repeat authors on this list. I think there are 9 authors who have 2 novels on the list, and then we have 3 Thomas Hardy novels, 3 Ian Forster novels, 5 Jane Austen novels, and 7 Charles Dickens novels, which is obviously ridiculous. I think we can all agree that no matter how wonderful Charles Dickens is, he is my favourite author / my joint favourite author. But it's definitely not the case that Charles Dickens wrote 7% of the best novels of all time. I think we can agree that's not the case. But isn't it fascinating that he has this many books on the list? So one thing I think is always really interesting to look out for this kind of list is what are the biases of the sample. I have obviously called this Booktube's best 100 novels of all time, but what it actually is is the best 100 novels of all time in the opinion of people who watch my channel specifically. I suppose some people might have shared it, and some people who don't watch my channel that often might have replied to the survey, but generally I think the people who replied to the survey are people who watch my channel. If another booktuber from another booktube channel had run this same survey, I'm sure there would not be 7 Dickens novels on this list. There wouldn't be, but because I love Dickens and talk about Dickens a lot, the chance of a sample of people who watch my channel loving Dickens is just much higher. So a few other sort of patterns and biases, I suppose, if you will, that I wanted to look at before I get going on the books themselves. I'm obviously an English language booktuber and I read in English. I do read things that are translated, but the only language I read in is English. And I imagine the majority of people who watch my channel predominantly read in English, so I don't think it's hugely surprising that the list is very English language dominated. Interestingly, I would say that like across the whole 1,268 nominations, there were a lot of books from all over the world in a lot of different original languages, but the ones that got the most votes are like vast majority original English language titles. Likewise, the list is very dominated by UK and US authors, which I think does reflect like the people who watch my channel. I think 3/4 of the list is British or US authors, and I think like 55 to 60% of my audience is British or US. Obviously, plenty of people who are from the UK and the US read a lot of books from a lot of different countries, but I think people are more likely to have read like the big famous classics of the place that they are from. The earliest book on the list is from 1605 and the latest is from 2020, which is relatively recent, I would say, for this kind of list, which I think is good. But the 19th century and especially Victorian British literature is like very overrepresented. I think we have 24 Victorian novels on the list, and as much as I love Victorian literature, I don't think 1/4 of the best novels of all time were written by Victorians. I think more than 1/4 of my favourite novels of all time would be written by the Victorians, but when it comes to like the best books, do I really think a whole 1/4 would be written by the Victorians? Probably not. But you know, that obviously reflects the reading taste of the people who watch my channel, because I talk about Victorian literature a lot. And one thing I found really interesting is that like all my own personal favourite authors are very much overrepresented on this list. Like obviously Dickens, as I said earlier, like 7 books is a lot to have on one list. Austen, 5 out of her 6 novels made this list. And also Anthony Trollope, Ian Forster, Elizabeth Gaskell, Thomas Hardy, I would say are more present on this list than I would expect on this kind of list. And that is because they are authors that I love and talk about a lot. So people who watch my channel are more likely to love them, either because they have got recommendations from this channel or because they have come to this channel because they love those authors and are looking for people talking about those authors. So I found this survey and this list very interesting because I always find these lists very interesting, but I've also found it really interesting as a like snapshot of the taste of people who watch my videos, which is quite cool. So there we go. One thing I did also want to address before I get going on the list is how I have dealt with series, because there are a few series in this list. What I said at the sort of opening introduction to the survey was that a series that is one body of work, that is one work of literature, I would treat as one work of literature. But a series that is really a series of standalone books with recurring characters, I would not treat as a series. So by that logic, The Lord of the Rings is one work of literature, one book, but the Poirot series by Agatha Christie would be separate books, because you can read those books without each other. You don't have to read them in order, you don't have to read them all, like they stand on their own in a way that the individual volumes of The Lord of the Rings don't. There were a few series where some people put as their best novel of all time the whole series, and some people put an individual book from that series. I decided ultimately to count votes for an individual book within the series as a vote for the whole series, which I don't necessarily think is a perfect way of doing it, because someone might love the second book in a series and not the third. But I also felt that where some people had voted for the whole series, it didn't feel fair to like not count that vote. So I ended up counting like a vote for the whole series and a vote for one book in the series as a vote for the series as a whole. One other thing I found interesting to look at was how much crossover there was with the Guardian's list, which sort of started off this whole project. So this list, Booktube's best 100 novels of all time, has 47 titles in common with the Guardian's best novels of all time list, the one made by critics. And then the Guardian also made a second list based on readers' votes, and this list has 52 titles in common with that list. This list basically is like half the same as the Guardians list, but half different. I'm gonna try and write up and publish a written version of this list on my website so people can like look through, and I'll try and put covers in, and I'll leave it linked down below. One final thing to explain, I feel like this has been the longest introduction ever, but I will leave a timestamp down below for anyone who wants to skip straight to the list. But the way I have ordered these titles from 100 to 1, I've ordered them by how many votes they got. So obviously there were some books that got the same number of votes, and so when multiple books had the same number of votes, I have ordered them by how high the votes were. So I asked people to rank their best novels of all time from 10 to 1. So a book that got 9 votes but had more votes at number 1 would be higher on my list than a book that got 9 votes but had no number 1 votes, if that makes sense. I hope that does. Okay, right, let's finally do the list. At number 100, we have The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner from 1929. This is a US novel, and this got 9 votes. I have not read The Sound of the Fury, so I don't know very much about it. From my quick look online, I gather that it follows 4 siblings and what happens as their sort of wealthy or used to be wealthy family descends into chaos. It sounds quite interesting. I always hear lots about William Faulkner, but he's not an author I've ever picked up before. At number 99, we have A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. This is a British novel from 1980, which also got 9 votes, but more high votes. This is another novel I haven't read, which follows a man called Tom, who is a former soldier from the First World War, and it's about his work uncovering a mural in a village church. I haven't read it, so I don't know that much about it. It hasn't really been on my radar, but maybe it should be. At number 98, another book I haven't read, we have Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This is a US novel from 1952, also got 9 votes. This is a novel that I have been meaning to read for ages. It's narrated by an unnamed black man who is talking about the sort of social issues faced by African Americans in the early 20th century. I have heard very, very good things about Invisible Man, and it's just one I haven't quite got to yet. At 97, we have A Passage to India by Ian Forster. This is a British novel from 1924. I have read this one, and it's a really interesting novel. It looks at various characters who are living in India, some of whom are British, some of whom are Indian. And it looks at British imperialism and the messy power structures and complicated dynamics that come with it. It's a really complicated criticism of imperialism by a real favourite author of mine. I love Ian Forster. I think he writes fantastically, really complex characters, really interesting moral and social issues. I highly recommend A Passage to India. Number 96 is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, a US novel from 1885. I have read this one and I didn't love it. Something about the writing style and sort of the episodic format of it that just didn't quite work for me. But this novel follows a young boy called Huckleberry Finn who runs away from home, and his companion on his adventures is a runaway slave called Jim. Not a personal favourite of mine, but 9 people who filled out the survey said it was one of their 10 best novels of all time. At number 95, we have Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, the first of many Jane Austen books on this list. This is a British novel from 1811, which follows the Dashwood family, specifically 2 sisters, Eleanor and Marianne. Their complicated romantic relationships, their families sort of fall from wealth to less wealth, and it is a really powerful story of sisterhood. I really love Sense and Sensibility very, very much. Jane Austen is one of my absolute favourite authors of all time, and this is a great book, which also got 9 votes. Actually, quite a lot of the books early on in the list got the same number of votes, so I'm going to stop saying for each individual one. We're done with the books that got 9 votes, now we're moving on to the books that got 10 votes. At number 94, we have The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, a British novel from 1950. This is a children's novel which tells the story of Lucy, Peter, Edmund and Susan, 4 siblings who are evacuated during the Second World War and stumble across the doorway to another world in the back of a wardrobe. I love The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. I haven't read it for a very long time, but it is a very charming, delightful book and part of a really interesting series. Interestingly, this is one of the novels in this list that is part of a series, but the series itself did not get any votes. I think maybe 1 or 2 other books from the series might have got some votes, but really all the votes were focused around The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Also, it is a series that stands relatively separate. There are recurring characters and there are some links between the books in the series, but they do sort of stand relatively on their own with separate stories. So I feel like I would not have counted it as one work. At 93, we have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, a US novel from 1962 and a fantastic novel. This is a classic work of I guess maybe gothic horror. Is it really full horror? Anyway, We Have Always Lived in the Castle tells a story of two sisters who live in a crumbling castle, and many years ago lots of their family passed away, and there has been a lot of speculation in the village that the elder sister killed the rest of the family, and we follow the lives of these two girls, and it is dark and twisty and marvellous in every way. At number 92 we have The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James from 1881. Whether Henry James counts as British or American, I don't know, probably both, as he lived his life between the two, but The Portrait of a Lady is a book I have not read. It follows the story, apparently, of a young American woman and various people who are trying to like get a hold of her fortune. I think I have read a little bit of Henry James, by which I mean I have read The Turn of the Screw and a few short stories, and I don't really get on with his writing style, but I really haven't read very much by him, so I should give one of his longer books a try, and maybe it should be The Portrait of a Lady. At number 91 we have Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell from 1936. This is a US novel, which is a historical novel set during the Civil War, following Scarlett O'Hara, the daughter of a slave plantation owner. I have not read Gone with the Wind, and to be honest, I don't really feel any inclination to read it. I think I've heard quite a lot of people talk about, you know, how it is quite a difficult read as a modern reader because of the racism within it, and it's not a book that particularly appeals to me, I would say. So interesting to see it on this list, but not necessarily one that I am likely to pick up myself. At number 90 we have the first non-English language book, I think, which is The Hunchback of Notre-Dame by Victor Hugo, which is a French novel from 1831. I read The Hunchback of Notre-Dame a few years ago, about a decade ago probably actually, and I quite liked it, but not as much as Les Miserables. The Hunchback of Notre-Dame is a historical novel, so it was written in the 19th century, but it's set in 15th century Paris, and it looks at various characters who kind of surround the Cathedral of Notre-Dame, including the titular character Quasimodo, and a young Romany woman called Esmeralda. If you have seen the Disney film, the book is very, very different and so much darker. I also feel that the English language title is not that great a title. The original title is just Notre Dame de Paris, which doesn't like centre Quasimodo, which I think is more true to the book than the English language title. Anyway, at number 89 we have our first Dickens novel, Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens, a British novel from 1857. This is definitely a novel that I do not think would make it onto most lists of the best 100 novels of all time. I do love Little Dorrit very much. It is my personal third or fourth favourite Dickens novel, depending on the day, but I don't think it is as universally beloved as many other Dickens novels. It tells the story of a young woman, Amy Dorrit, who was born in the Marshalsea prison. Her father has been in prison for debt for a very, very long time, and she lives her life trying to support him until various things are set in motion and her life begins to change. It is, I think, Dickens's best love story, as well as looking really interestingly at money and capitalism, and sort of how money is viewed in the Victorian period. I think it's a truly wonderful novel, and I would highly, highly recommend it, even if, as I said, I don't think it would have quite made a list that was made by another set of people. At number 88 we have A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. This is a US novel from 1989. This is not a novel I've read, so I don't know too much about it, but it apparently is about the friendship of John Wheelwright and Owen Meany, who grow up together in a small town in New Hampshire in the 1950s and 1960s. Not a novel I've read, but 10 people said it would make their 10 best novels of all time, so maybe I should read it. At number 87 we have Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This is a US novel from 1937 and a really wonderful one. I have read this, I love it very much. I specifically listened to an audiobook of it, which I would highly recommend because the audiobook worked very well. This is a novel about a woman called Janie, sort of looking back on her life and the men she has spent her life with, as well as the difficulties within her life. It's a really powerful, beautifully written novel that I would highly, highly recommend. At number 86 we have The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is a US novel from 1969. And it is a really wonderful, powerful, interesting work of science fiction that I read a few years ago and would love to reread. The Left Hand of Darkness tells a story of a man who travels to an alien planet in order to try and like further a diplomatic mission, I guess. And this is a planet where there is no gender. This book kind of examines what it means to not have a concept of gender, and for someone with a gender to go to a society that doesn't have gender. And it's just a really, really interesting novel in so many ways. Like I said, really one I need to reread. At number 85, we have The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. This is a novel from 2003. Khaled Hosseini is originally from Afghanistan but lives in the US now, I believe. And this novel is one I haven't read, though I have read another book by Khaled Hosseini, And the Mountains Echoed, which is fantastic. Not exactly a novel, more of a collection of short stories, but they are interconnected. Anyway, but I definitely should read The Kite Runner because I loved And the Mountains Echoed, and I read it probably about 6 years ago now, so I need to read more by him. But The Kite Runner, I gather, is the story of a young boy, Amir, growing up in Afghanistan. He looks at sort of his life and his coming of age against the background of the tumultuous events going on in Afghanistan at the time. I would really, really like to read this. As I said, it's one I should try and get to soon. At number 84, we have A Room with a View by Ian Forster. This is a British novel from 1908, which tells the story of a young woman who is travelling abroad with her cousin, a relation, shall we say. It's been quite a long time since I read this book, but it tells the story of a young woman travelling abroad in Italy, and she meets a man who she is attracted to, but he is from a slightly different social class to her own, and it's kind of about what goes on from there. I love A Room with a View. It's not my personal favourite Ian Forster, but I do think it's fantastic. There's only one Ian Forster that I don't love, to be honest, The Longest Journey, which isn't on the list, which is just as well. But the rest of his work I absolutely love. I think he's a fantastic writer. Next, at number 83, we have Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. This is a novel from 1955. Nabokov was from Russia but settled in the US, and I think the majority of his work was written in English. Lolita certainly was originally written in English. Lolita is a book I haven't read. It is a story of a fully grown man grooming a young 12-year-old girl, and by all accounts is written in a very beautiful way as he tries to excuse his actions. I, to be honest, have just no interest in reading Lolita, with the subject matter being what it is. It doesn't matter to me how beautifully it's written or how much the novel is condemning the narrator's actions. Like, I just don't want to read it. Okay, so we're now done with the books that got 10 votes, and now we're moving on to the books that got 11 votes. At number 82, we have Passing by Nella Larsen, which is a US novel from 1929. I'm so glad that this made the list. I think I put this on my personal list of 10 best novels of all time that I submitted to the survey, but I will probably check that at some point. Maybe I'll tell you in the honourable mentions video what books I put on my own list. But I love Passing. I think it's incredible. Passing tells the story of two women who knew each other when they were young. They are both light-skinned African-American women. One of them has married a man with darker skin than her own and lives very much in the African-American community of the 1920s in Harlem. And the other woman passes as white and lives her life pretending to be white. She has married a very racist man who doesn't know that she isn't white. And these two women meet by chance again at the beginning of the novel, and we follow how they affect each other's lives and the directions this book goes in, like, you just wouldn't expect. It's so good, and the ending is just, oh, it's fantastic. I love Passing. What an incredible novel. By number 81, we have Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie from 1981. Salman Rushdie is from India but settled in Britain for a long time, and I think he now lives in the US. Midnight's Children is a really interesting novel which I have read, though quite a long time ago. I studied it at university actually, and it kind of begins with India gaining independence from Britain, and it follows a young boy who is born on the stroke of midnight when India gains independence. And the idea in the book is that all of the children born on the stroke of midnight, born at the moment of independence, have some kind of magical powers. Do they have different magical powers, or do they all just have the ability to talk to each other in their heads? I can't remember. It's been more than a decade since I read it, but great book in my opinion. Really interestingly written, very playful with language, spans a long period of time, does lots of interesting things. I would highly recommend it. At number 80, we have Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, a US novel from 1961. This is a novel I haven't read, but I gather it is a satirical novel about the Second World War. I don't know that I am particularly excited to read Catch-22. Maybe I should be, but it's not a book that has ever particularly appealed to me. At number 79, we have The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann from 1924. This is a German novel. This is not one I've read, though I have read Death in Venice by Thomas Mann, which I really enjoyed. That's only a very short thing though, so I would like to read something longer by him. The Magic Mountain, I believe, is about a man called Hans who is staying at a sanatorium, like in the time leading up to 1914 and the First World War, and it's about his experiences there. And it sounds like quite an interesting read. At number 78, we have Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, a French novel from 1857. I have read Madame Bovary and I really, really did not like it at all, to be honest. Very much wasn't for me. Really didn't gel with it. But there we go. 11 people who answered my survey said it was one of their best novels of all time, but it obviously just wasn't quite for me. Madame Bovary tells a story of a young couple who get married, but are not quite suited to each other, and Madame Bovary, the wife, begins to have affairs, and yeah, it wasn't really for me. At number 77, we have The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. This is an Italian novel from 1980, which is a historical murder mystery set in the 14th century in an Italian monastery. I have not read The Name of the Rose, but I would really like to. This is a good reminder that I have vaguely been meaning to read The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco for a long time, so sounds like I should. At number 76, we have Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, a British novel from 1814. I love Mansfield Park. I have read it goodness knows how many times. It's one of my favourite novels, my second favourite novel by Jane Austen. Mansfield Park tells the story of Fanny Price, who at an early age is sent away from her family home to live with her wealthy relations. And this book looks at class and loneliness and home and a sense of belonging. And it is a really powerful, intricate, interesting novel that for me improves with every reread. Okay, those were all the books that got 11 votes. Then we have one book that got 12 votes, and that is at number 75, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This is a Canadian novel from 1985. The Handmaid's Tale I read a good decade ago, and it's a story of a dystopian society in which fertility rates are going down, and women who are still able to have children are basically forced to do so by the states, and forced to act as handmaids. So not a personal favourite of mine. It is a really interesting novel and definitely worth a read. Now we have a few books that got 13 votes. At number 74 we have Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. James Baldwin was an American writer, and this novel is from 1956, and it's a wonderful book that I would highly recommend. I love Giovanni's Room. This reminds me that I need to read more by James Baldwin because it's the only novel of his I've read. I have also read his non-fiction work, The Fire Next Time. Giovanni's Room tells a story of a young man who is living in Paris. He is engaged to a woman, but she is away for some time. And while she is away, he meets and falls in love with a young man called Giovanni. It's about his struggles with his sexuality, as well as about this passionate relationship between these two men, and it's just a really fantastic book. At number 73 we have The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, a British novel from 1937. I haven't read The Hobbit, but I do know that it is the story of Bilbo Baggins going on a quest. Do I know any more than that? I do really want to read The Hobbit. I should read The Hobbit. I feel like it's one of those odd gaps in my reading. I'm not really sure how I have got to the age of 33 without having read The Hobbit, especially considering that I do enjoy fantasy books. So maybe I'll read The Hobbit soon. I think at some point in the next few months, I'm going to do a video that is like a 40 before 40 list. 40 books I want to read before I'm 40, because I really enjoy watching other people's videos like that, and The Hobbit would definitely be on that list. At number 72, we have Dune by Frank Herbert, a US novel from 1965. This is a science fiction classic that I have read, that tells a story of a young man called Paul who may or may not be a messiah, and a desert planet that contains a very valuable resource. It's an interesting science fiction novel with some really interesting magical elements and a lot of interesting politics. I will admit though that I enjoyed the two films a lot more than I enjoyed the books, which I think is partly because the films strip out a lot of the 1960s sexism that is a very big feature of Dune, the novel, but also because I don't have a very good visual imagination, and Dune, the world of Dune, is such a visually spectacular world that I just didn't really get from the book in the same way I got from the films. So there we go. Anyway, at number 71, we have Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, a British novel from 1895. I have read Jude the Obscure multiple times. I love it very, very much. This is a very powerful, very miserable novel about a man called Jude, who's from a working class background but wants to be a scholar. He loves studying, he loves Latin and Greek, and he wants to go to Christminster, the university, but because of his background so many doors are closed for him, and it tells the story of his life and his relationship with two two different women, and I just think it is fantastic. At number 70, we have Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. This is a British novel from 2020, one of the newest books on this list. I think there's one other novel from 2020 coming up later. Hamlet tells the story of William Shakespeare and his family, specifically focusing on his wife and his children. It's a story of family, but it's also really a story of grief and loss, and it's a very, very powerful read. I thought Hamlet was great when I read it a few years ago. I don't think it would make my personal 100 best novels of all time. I think it was probably a 4-star read for me rather than a 5-star read, but I do think it's a great book and well worth your time. I've been filming for such a long time, but I'm not even halfway through the list. I feel like this is going to be a very long video, but anyway, at number 69, we have Villette by Charlotte Bronte, a British novel from 1853, one of the many Victorian books on this list. Villette is a novel I've read many times. I'm very fond of it, and it tells the story of Lucy Snow, a young woman who leaves her home in England to travel to Belgium to become a teacher. It's a novel about unrequited love and loneliness with a really fascinating central heroine, and I highly, highly recommend it. Now I have some books that got 14 votes. At number 68, we have the series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, which began in 1996 and I gather is still not finished. George R.R. Martin is an author from the USA. I think the majority of the 14 votes this series got were for the series, but I think there were maybe 2 or 3 votes for specific novels within the series. I do feel a bit complicatedly about putting a series on this list that isn't actually finished, but you know, here it is. I have not read any of A Song of Ice and Fire. I don't feel a particular burning need to. I feel like I've sort of like missed the moment, and there are other fantasy series that appeal to me more, but it is a big epic fantasy series with a lot of like politics and warring factions in it, I gather. In my preparations for this video, I wrote a little summary about what all the books are about that I hadn't read yet, but I have missed out A Song of Ice and Fire and have no notes on it. So, you know, in the interest of keeping this video shorter than it might otherwise be, I will move on to the next book, which at number 67 is Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, British novel from 1848. Vanity Fair, I have read a good 18 years ago perhaps, so it's not very fresh in my mind, but it tells the story of a young woman called Becky Sharp, who doesn't have that much money and is determined to get on in the world, and she is a bit of an anti-heroine who is sort of scheming her way up through society, but there's also something about her that is kind of appealing. Vanity Fair is a really interesting novel, and definitely one I am keen to reread. At number 66 we have A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. This is a novel from 1995. Rohinton Mistry is from India but lives in Canada now, I believe, and this novel is set in India in the 1970s and the 1980s in an unnamed city, and it takes place during the emergency, focusing on 4 characters from very different backgrounds who end up sort of coming together. I have not read A Fine Balance, and I had actually never heard of it until it appeared on The Guardian's Best 100 Novels of All Time list, and it sounds so up my street. This sounds so much like a book I would love that I feel like I need to read it very, very soon. So when I make that 40 before 40 list / video at some point in the next few months, I think A Fine Balance will be on it too. At number 65 we have Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, a British novel from 1866. This is a wonderful novel, a real personal favourite of mine. It tells the story of Molly Gibson, a young woman who has grown up for a long time living just with her father, and one day when she's sort of on the cusp of womanhood, when she's about 17 years old I think, her father decides that it would be good for Molly to have a mother figure and that he is going to remarry. So he remarries and brings into their household a stepmother and a stepsister for Molly, and suddenly Molly's life completely changes, and it's about her relationship with her new stepmother and stepsister, but it's also about her relationship with a nearby family called the Hamleys, who are just like some of the best characters ever. Squire Hamley, one of the most realistic, fully formed characters ever created, in my opinion, like one of the single best characters in the whole of literature. I love Wives and Daughters, it's fantastic. There we go. At number 65 we have Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. This is an American novel from 1969. This, I believe, is a novel about the Second World War with some sort of science fiction elements. I believe there's like a time travel element to it. I have not read Slaughterhouse-5, as you probably gathered from that terrible description of it, but it is one I'm quite keen to read. Do I have it on my shelves, or do I have a different book by Kurt Vonnegut? No, I think I have Cat's Cradle. Vonnegut is an author I've been meaning to try for a long time, especially because I know my friend Marisha from Blatantly Bookish really likes his work. So at some point, I hope I will read Slaughterhouse-5. At number 63, we have The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. This is a US novel from 1920. I haven't read The Age of Innocence, though I have read a few other books by Edith Wharton, and I really love her writing style. She's definitely an author I want to read more by. This book, I believe, is set in the 1870s and follows sort of upper class society in New York. I believe it begins with a lawyer who is sort of torn between marrying two very different women, and I sort of don't want to know too much more about it than that, because I know I really like Edith Wharton, and I'm sure I will enjoy this book when I get to it. At number 62, we have the Neapolitan novels by Italian author Elena Ferrante. This is a quartet of novels published between 2011 and 2014. Some of the votes that I have counted for this series as a whole were just for My Brilliant Friend, the first book. Some of them were for later books in the series, some of them were for the whole series. And this is not a series that I have read. I believe it follows the lives of the narrator Eleanor and her oldest friend, like over a long period of time. I have never felt a particular burning desire to read My Brilliant Friend and the rest of the series. But I know a lot of people really, really love them, so, you know, feel free to persuade me otherwise. Then I have two books that got 15 votes each. At number 61, we have The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. This is an Australian novel from 2005, set during the Second World War. It tells the story of a young girl and her experiences during the Second World War in Germany, and the book is narrated by the figure of death, which is great. I love The Book Thief. It's been a very long time since I've read it, but I think it's a fantastic book and one I would highly recommend. At number 60, we have Stoner by John Williams. This is a US novel from 1965. I haven't read this one. I gather it's a campus novel about a university professor and his marriage and an affair he's having. It doesn't particularly appeal to me, to be honest, from the premise, but I know a lot of people love it very much. Then next we have a bunch of books that got 16 votes. At number 59, we have Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is an Irish novel from 1897, and this is a sort of classic work of vampire fiction, looking at various characters who sort of come together to fight off the vampiric threat that is Dracula, and it's told in an epistolary form through letters and diary entries and phonograph recordings and various other things like that. I am not a big fan of Dracula, shall we say. I studied Dracula at A-level, and I think it's one of those books where I didn't really like it, and then I had to read it a lot of times to study it at school, which made me like it so much less. A lot of people love it. I understand why. It just, yeah, isn't for me. At number 58, we have The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. This is a British novel from 1860. The Woman in White is a sort of classic of Victorian sensation fiction. We begin with an art teacher who has a mysterious encounter on the road with a woman dressed all in white, which seems somehow to be linked to his new students, and everything kind of goes on from there. I really like The Woman in White. I think it's a really interesting novel with some really interesting elements and well worth a read. I think this is the only Wilkie Collins on this list. My personal favourite would be The Moonstone. I think The Moonstone is a stronger novel than The Woman in White, but 16 people do not agree with me, so there we go. At number 57, we have Howard's End by Ian Forster, a British novel from 1910. I really love Howard's End. I think it's fantastic. Probably my second favourite Ian Forster novel. My personal favourite Ian Forster novel, Maurice, didn't quite make the list, but I'm glad to see Howard's End on here. Howard's End is a really powerful, interesting novel that tells the story of various families who sort of interconnect in various different ways. It's just a really interesting novel that doesn't go in the directions you expect it to. One of my favourite things about Ian Forster is that his books are really unpredictable, and I just love Howard's End. I would highly, highly recommend it. At number 56, we have Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. This is a British novel from 1945. Brideshead Revisited tells a story of Charles Ryder and his sort of like passionate obsession for the Flight family. He meets Sebastian Flight at university and later ends up meeting his sister and his mother and the rest of his family. He sort of becomes obsessed with the whole Flight family and their house Brideshead as a whole. I like Brideshead Revisited, but I don't love it. Evelyn Waugh is an interesting author where his style changed quite a lot over his career, and I personally prefer his earlier novels like Vile Bodies, which are written in a much more like stripped back, spare fashion. Brideshead Visited is a lot more sort of lyrical, purple prose, which is less my thing. I also find Charles Ryder a very frustrating main character, which I think maybe you're kind of meant to, but anyway. At number 55, we have Barge to the Towers by Anthony Trollope, a British novel from 1857. I'm very glad to see some Anthony Trollope on this list because I love his books so much, and Barge to the Towers is wonderful. This is the second book in the Barsetshire Chronicles, which is a series of interconnected novels taking place in the fictional county of Barsetshire. Barge to the Towers follows what happens when a new bishop arrives in the cathedral city of Barchester, who has slightly different religious views from some of the clergymen already in place there. It documents all of the gossip and infighting that follows, as well as various romantic subplots and other things going on. And I just think it is marvellous. It is funny and witty and really entertaining, as well as having a lot of serious themes and wonderful moments, and I just love it very much. At number 54, we have A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Bessie Smith. This is a US novel from 1943. This is a coming-of-age story about a young girl growing up in Brooklyn, in poverty, and her sort of efforts to make a life for herself. I read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn a few years ago. I really liked it at the time, but it didn't make a massive impression on me. I don't remember it that well now, but I do think it's worth a read. I have two books that got 17 votes each. At number 53, we have The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov from 1967. This is a Russian novel. This is one I haven't read, but I gather it is a dark satirical novel about the devil visiting the Soviet Union, which I think sounds kind of great. I feel like I should read The Master and Margarita. It's one of those books that has been vaguely on my radar for sort of years and years and years, and I've never got to, so sounds like I should. At number 52, we have A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which is a British novella from 1843. I sort of ummed and ahed about whether A Christmas Carol counted as a novel. I think the Guardian's list had Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka on, which is shorter than A Christmas Carol, so I think we're gonna allow A Christmas Carol. I mean, it's on the list. A Christmas Carol is a wonderful Christmas novella by Charles Dickens, which tells a story of Ebenezer Scrooge, a miser being visited by various ghosts on Christmas Eve who tell him to mend his ways. I have read it countless times. I love it very, very much. I think it is wonderful. Next, we have a few books that got 18 votes. At number 51, we have Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, a British novel from 2020. I'm so pleased to see Piranesi on this list. I love Piranesi. It's a wonderful book. This is another of the sort of most recent books on this list. I think Piranesi and Hamlet are the two most modern books on this list. Piranesi follows a man who is living in a world made of rooms and halls, and he is one of the only people in the world. There is one other person in the world who he sees occasionally and who sometimes gives him things, but there's no one else really. He lives a sort of lonely, solitary life, collecting things and sort of surviving, and slowly over the course of the novel you begin to understand what this world is, what this man is doing here, and what is going on, and it's just great. It's just so good. It's such a perfect work of fiction, in my opinion. At number 50, finally we are halfway through, we have Ulysses by James Joyce. This is an Irish novel from 1922. I have not read Ulysses, but it is a modernist novel set over one day following Leonard Bloom and his day. I don't think I am likely to ever read Ulysses. I'm not a massive fan of modernist fiction in general, and I feel like Ulysses is quite experimental and probably not really my kind of thing. I have read one book by James Joyce, his short story collection Dubliners, which I didn't get much out of and didn't really like, so I think probably James Joyce is not really an author for me. At number 49, we have In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. This is a French novel in 7 volumes, published between 1913 and 1927. I haven't read In Search of Lost Time. I gather it is a work about memory and looks at a man sort of looking back on the recollections of his life. I don't feel particularly inclined to read In Search of Lost Time, to be honest. I guess the fact that it's in 7 volumes slightly would intimidate me, but it's not a book that's ever hugely appealed to me. But I know a lot of people love it a lot. And I thought it was interesting to see it on this list, as well as on the Guardian's sort of critics list. It is obviously a book that is very highly regarded by those who have read it. Then we have 2 books with 19 votes each. At number 48, we have And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. This is is a British novel from 1939, and I'm very glad to see it on this list because I do think it's fantastic. This is one of Agatha Christie's sort of more sort of thriller-esque books rather than a sort of straightforward murder mystery. It follows 10 people who arrive on an island. They have all been invited there under false pretenses, and when they get there, they realise that they are all there because they have all been responsible in some way for the death of another person. Somebody has decided that they deserve to die for what they have done, and therefore they have been brought to this island, and slowly they start to be picked off. Agatha Christie writes it so well, and I just think it is Agatha Christie's best book of the ones I have read by her so far, which is quite a lot, but you know, not all of them by a long stretch. She wrote so much, but I do think Another One Done is amazing. I've read it twice. At number 47, we have The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which is a US novel from 1992. Which I personally really hated, but there we go. So The Secret History tells the story of a young man who has gone to university, and at university, while studying Greek, I think, he meets this group of like quite posh, quite pretentious people, and he sort of wants to be one of them. And various things happen with this group that results in the death of a member of this group, and you know that from the beginning. I know many people love The Secret History very much, but Donna Tartt's writing style is really, really not for me. I find her books very, very overwritten and very overwrought. There's just too much sort of lyrical prose and too many beautiful descriptions and too many sort of saying the same thing 10 times in 10 different beautiful ways, but I didn't need to hear it 10 times. Her books are just way too literary for me. I have read The Goldfinch as well, and both The Goldfinch and The Secret History I really didn't like. I don't know why I read one and then read another one by her. I shouldn't have done so. You know, she's obviously on this list because she is so well regarded by many people, but she's not an author for me personally. At number 46, we have The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. This is a US novel from 1951, which is a coming-of-age story following the character of Holden Caulfield, who I think at the beginning of the book has just been expelled from school, and then it follows what happens to him. This book got 20 votes. I have not read it myself, and I'm not particularly inclined to do so. I feel like I have heard that Catcher in the Rye is a book that you should read like in your early 20s to fully appreciate, and I feel like I've kind of missed the boat, and I also, you know, it's not a book that particularly appeals to me necessarily. At number 45, also with 20 votes, we have 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is a Colombian novel from 1965, originally published in Spanish. I have read 100 Years of Solitude. It is a novel following various generations of one family over a long period of time, with magical realist elements. And the fact that that is all I can really tell you about the book probably tells you that I didn't really get on with it. It wasn't for me at all. I really didn't get on with the writing style, and I found it very dry. I understand why a lot of people respect it, but it wasn't one for me at all. I think it's interesting. Obviously, I said at the beginning of this video that you can see a lot of the biases of my taste reflected in this list, not because I have created this list, because as I said, obviously it's from a survey, but because I obviously share a lot of taste with the people who watch my videos, who are the people who replied to the survey, but also I obviously have very different tastes from people who watch my videos in some incidences. There's quite a lot of books on this list that I didn't like at all, which is kind of interesting. Obviously these books are on this list because a lot of people love them, so, you know, the fact that I don't like them, in my personal subjective opinion, shouldn't put you off reading them if they sound like they might be for you. At number 44, we have The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. This is a US novel from 1905. I have read this book by Edith Wharton. I loved it very, very much. This got 21 votes, and it is the story of a character called Lily Bart, sort of navigating her position as an unmarried woman. And it's just a really powerful, clever novel with really great characterization. I highly recommend The House of Mirth, and I definitely need to read more by Edith Wharton. At number 43, we have All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. This is a German novel from 1928, and this one received 21 votes. And I have read it. I think it's fantastic. I read it quite a long time ago now, but it is a World War I novel looking at German soldiers during the First World War and the sort of desperation and futility of being a soldier during the First World War. It is a fantastic book that is really, really worth your time and incredibly moving and powerful. So I highly, highly recommend All Quiet on the Western Front. I'm very glad to see it on this list. Next, we have two books that got 22 votes each. At number 42, we have Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. This is a British novel from 1865, and it is my personal favourite novel ever. So I'm very glad to see this on this list. Our Mutual Friend is is the story of various characters who are all sort of brought together by London, by the River Thames, and by a fortune made in dust and rubbish. It's a fantastic, wonderful, powerful novel with so many of my favourite characters from all of literature, and so many fantastic moments. It has the best antagonist in Charles Dickens, in my opinion. It has the best female characters in Charles Dickens, in my opinion. I just think it's a great novel in every way, and I love it so much. And yeah, there we go. As I said, my personal favourite novel of all time. At number 41, we have Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, which is a Spanish novel from either 1605 or 1615. Can't remember why this book has two dates. Maybe it came out in two parts. Anyway, this is an early modern Spanish novel about a man who has read too many chivalric romances and therefore wants to revive chivalry and behaves, therefore, I presume, in a silly fashion. I have not read Don Quixote, but I would really like to. Next, we have two books that got 23 votes each. At number 40, we have The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. This is a British novel from 1875, and another of my favourite novels of all time. I'm very glad that there are two Anthony Trollope books on this list. I definitely think that is down to how much I talk about Anthony Trollope, and therefore how many fans of Anthony Trollope watch this channel. But I'm very glad to see The Way We Live Now on this list, because I do think it's incredible. A bit like Our Mutual Friend, it is a novel set in London following a lot of different characters, all brought together by a fortune. And it's just a fantastic novel that looks at money and corruption and society and marriage and so many other things, and I just love it a lot. Then number 39, we have A Tale of Two Cities, another Charles Dickens novel. This is a British novel from 1859 that is set in the 1780s and 90s during the French Revolution. It's a really interesting novel that is not my favourite Dickens novel, but has the best ending and my favourite ending to any Dickens novel. The ending of A Tale of Two Cities is just like the most magnificent thing ever written, but I don't love the rest of the novel as much. I do like it, but it's just not like as long with as many things going on as most Dickens novels, and I do find the characters of Lucy Manette and Charles Darnay a little bit dull. Next we have two books that got 24 votes each. At number 38 we have Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Very glad to see this on this list. This is a British novel from 2005. I love Ishiguro's work a lot. He's one of my absolute favourite writers. Never Let Me Go is a wonderful speculative novel set in a slightly alternative version of the UK, following three children growing up in a boarding school, and it's very clear that things in this boarding school are not quite normal, that there is something different about these children, there is something going on at this school. I love Never Let Me Go so much. It is a novel about memory, about humanity, about emotion and art, and it's just beautiful and exquisite, and yeah, Ishiguro is the best. At number 37 we have To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, a British novel from 1929. This is a novel about a family planning a trip to a lighthouse. I have read it, but it was quite a long time ago, as you may have gathered from that very meagre description. Virginia Woolf is one of those authors who I respect more than like. I don't really gel with her writing style in general. Modernist literature is not really my kind of thing. I think she is obviously a very talented writer doing some really interesting things, but I didn't adore To the Lighthouse. But I do think it's an interesting novel. If you like modernist literature more than me, I'm sure you will get a lot out of it. Next, we have a few books that got 25 votes each. At number 36, we have Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. This is a US novel published in 1868. This is a coming-of-age story following four sisters, all of whom have quite different personalities. It has been a very long time since I read Little Women, but I loved it as a teenager, and I do think it's really worth a read. At number 35, we have the Wolf Hall trilogy by Hilary Mantel. Hilary Mantel was a British author, and these books were published between 2009 and 2020. The three books in the series are Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, and The Mirror and the Light. I have just started reading Wolf Hall for the first time. I don't feel like I have that many opinions on it yet, but the trilogy follows the life of Thomas Cromwell living in the Tudor court, the relationship with Henry VIII, and the various other figures around him. I have been meaning to read Wolf Hall for a very long time, and I'm finally reading it. We're doing it for the historical fiction book club that I run over on my Patreon, and it's very interesting so far, and I hope I will go on to read the rest of the trilogy. As with some of the other series in this list, I think quite a few of the votes were just for Wolf Hall, but some of the votes were also for the whole series or for later books in the series, so I have put them all together. At number 34, we have Far From the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, a British novel from 1874. Far from the Madding Crowd is one of my favourite Thomas Hardy novels. I love it very, very much. It's a wonderful novel telling the story of Bathsheba Everdeen, who inherits a farm from her uncle, decides to run the farm herself, which is very unusual for a woman in the Victorian period. And it's about her life on the farm and her three very different suitors. It's a fantastic, powerful novel. I reread it earlier this year, or maybe it was last year, and it just brought me so much joy to reread. I think it is incredible. And then at number 33, we have another Thomas Hardy novel, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is from 1892. This is the story of Tess, a young woman from a working class rural background, whose father finds out that their family are descended from sort of a higher class of people, and this sort of begins Tess on a road of misery, shall we say. Tess of the D'Urbervilles is a very miserable book where Tess goes through an awful lot of hardship. It's a really powerful, interesting novel with a lot of interesting social criticism. It's not my personal favourite Thomas Hardy novel. There are novels by him I love more, but I do understand why so many people rate it so highly, and I do think it's well worth a read. Next, at number 32, with 27 votes, we have Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. This is a US novel from 1985. And this is a western about several retired Texas Rangers and their adventures, apparently. I have not read Lonesome Dove. I hadn't really heard of it until recently, and then I feel like this past year on Booktube, everyone has been reading and raving about Lonesome Dove, so maybe I should read it at some point. Let me know what you think. At number 31, with 29 votes, we have 1984 by George Orwell. This is a British novel from 1949, and a really, really interesting dystopian novel about a man called Winston living in a dystopian future where Big Brother watches everything and everyone's lives are very much controlled. I've read it a couple of times, though not for a good decade now, but I would highly, highly recommend it. At number 30, with 29 votes, we have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, a British novel from 1890. This is a wonderful Victorian novel that tells a story of a young man called Dorian Gray who has a portrait painted of him, and after this portrait has been painted, Dorian Gray doesn't seem to age, and all of the terrible things that he does as he begins to live a hedonistic life of pleasure don't seem to have any impact on his physical form. It is a really cleverly written novel that is incredibly witty but also very dark, and just very much worth your time. At number 29, with 33 votes, we have Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf from 1925. As I said earlier, Virginia Woolf is not hugely for me, but I liked Mrs. Dalloway quite a lot more than To the Lighthouse. I also read it more recently. Mrs. Dalloway is set over, I think, just 24 hours and follows Mrs. Dalloway as she prepares for a party, as well as following a young man who has shell shock following the First World War. Like I said, Virginia Woolf's writing style is not necessarily perfectly to my taste, but I do highly recommend Mrs. Dalloway, and I do think it's a really interesting book. At number 28, with 34 votes, we have The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. This is a novel from the USA in 1939. This book is set during the Great Depression and is a novel, I believe, about a family of poor tenant farmers who end up leaving Oklahoma and moving to California. I have not read The Grapes of Wrath. I have read a couple of other John Steinbeck books, The Pearl and Of Mice and Men, neither of which I enjoyed at all, so I don't think he's really an author for me. Maybe I should try one of his longer books. Let me know if you think so. At number 27, with 37 votes, we have Beloved by Toni Morrison. This is a US novel from 1987. It's a historical novel, so set a good chunk before it was written, and it follows a woman and her daughter who have in the past been enslaved and are now free. But the woman finds herself continually haunted by a baby daughter who died. And it is a ghost story, but also so much more than that. It's a really powerful, incredibly dark novel. Beloved is the only book I've read by Toni Morrison, and I would definitely like to read more by her because I do think she's a fantastic writer. At number 26, with 38 votes, we have David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, a British novel from 1850. David Copperfield is a coming-of-age story, a Bildungsroman following the life of David Copperfield. David Copperfield has a difficult start in life, but we follow him over a long period of time, all of the people that he meets, and all the different ways they affect his life. I love David Copperfield very much. I think it's a wonderful novel. novel. There are Dickens novels I love more, but I do think it's a great novel, and I'm glad to see it on this list because I think it is well worth a read. At number 25, with 39 votes, we have The Tenant of Wildfire Hall by Anne Bronte. This is a British novel from 1848, another Victorian book. The Tenant of Wildfire Hall is a really powerful book that tells a story of a man called Gilbert who meets a woman called Mrs. Graham. Gilbert finds himself increasingly drawn towards Mrs. Graham, and she eventually tells him the story of her life by giving him her diary, and a lot of the book is her diary. And it's a book that is really interestingly proto-feminist for the Victorian period. It's a book that looks at marriage within Victorian society and the problematic power dynamics within it. It's a really incredible, powerful novel that I highly recommend. And number 24, with 42 votes, we have North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a British novel from 1855 and another one of my personal favourite novels of all time, so I'm very glad to see it on this list. It tells the story of Margaret Hale, who moves from the south of England to the north of England. She ends up living in Milton, a manufacturing town. She meets a mill owner there called Mr. Thornton, who she doesn't really like, but he quite likes her. And she also meets a family called the Higginses. We follow what is a wonderful love story, but also a great social critique novel, and also a book about grief and death, and it's just magnificent. It is possibly my favourite love story ever, and I just think it's wonderful, so I highly recommend North and South. What a book it is. At number 23, with 43 votes, we have Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Yes, more Dickens. This is a British novel from 1861, another Buildings for a Man, which tells the story of Pip. Pip grows up in a working class household. He is apprenticed to be a blacksmith, but one day a mysterious man arrives and says, "You, Pip, have great expectations. You are going to inherit a fortune." And suddenly Pip is pushed into the world of the upper classes, and it's just a marvellous book with great characterization and really fantastic plot. And while there are Dickens books I love more, I think maybe it is his best book, but also Our Mutual Friends is his best book, but maybe it's Great Expectations. At number 22, with 45 votes, we have The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is a US novel from 1925. I have read The Great Gatsby, but not for a good 15 years, if not longer, but I did like it when I read it. It is set in the US during the Prohibition era and follows a man called Jay Gatsby who has a lot of wealth and status, but not the one thing he wants. Like I said, been a long time since I read it, but I liked it a lot as a teenager. I think it's a really powerful, interesting novel. At number 21, with 47 votes, we have To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This is a US novel from 1960. Really great book, another coming-of-age story. This tells the story of Scout, a young girl growing up alongside her brother and her neighbour. It's a really powerful book looking at complex social issues through the eyes of a child, and it's just really worth a read. I haven't read it for a long time, but I studied it for GCSE, so it has really stayed with me, and I definitely recommend it. Right, we're into the top 20. I don't know how many hours long this video has been so far, but there we go. At number 20, with 47 votes, we have Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. This is a Canadian novel from 1908, which follows a young girl called Anne, who is sort of adopted / taken in by an older brother and sister, and we follow her life and her antics and her friendships, and it's just really charming and delightful. At number 19, with 48 votes, we have The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, which is a British novel from 1989. This is a fantastic work of historical fiction set in the 1950s and the 1930s, following the life of a butler called Stevens. And in the 1950s, he's sort of reflecting on his experiences during the war, working as a butler in a big house, his relationship with his master and his master's involvement in politics, his relationship with the housekeeper who he worked very closely with, and I just love The Remains of the Day, and I think it is the most perfect and possibly the best novel ever written. I can't remember what book I put at number 1 when I completed the survey myself, but I think it was The Remains of the Day. I think it was. I just think it is exquisite and perfect in every way, and I just can't recommend it enough. I reread it earlier this year and just was blown away all over again by how amazing it is. I think it is just a work of utter perfection. At number 18, with 48 votes, we have The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, which is a Russian novel from 1880. I haven't read this book, though I have read another book by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. The Brothers Karamazov, I believe, is about three brothers who have been neglected by their father, and I don't know very much more than that, which is fine because I would quite like to read it at some point. And at number 17 with 49 votes is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, a Russian novel from 1867. So I have read Crime and Punishment, which is a story of a man who commits a murder and then sort of thinks a lot about why he has done it, and the book is quite sort of philosophical about crime. When I was going through the list and writing myself notes for the books I hadn't read, I also should have written myself notes for the books I hadn't read for a long time. But anyway, Crime and Punishment is a really interesting novel. I read it as a teenager. I really liked it as a teenager. I have a very distinct memory of missing my bus stop because I was reading Crime and Punishment on the bus, which shows how much I was enjoying that book for two reasons. One, because I missed my bus stop, but also because I get motion sickness. So I can only have been reading the book on the bus because I really loved it. I do think it is a really interesting novel. I should probably read it sometime and read more by Dostoevsky. At number 16 with 51 votes, we have Persuasion by Jane Austen, a British novel from 1817. This is a story of Anne Elliot, who is in her late 20s, sort of getting past the marriageable age for the Regency period. And many years ago, she was engaged to a man she loved, but was persuaded to break off that engagement because his prospects weren't looking very good. 7 or 8 years later, he comes back into her life and everything goes on from there. It is a wonderful, beautiful novel. There are definitely Jane Austen novels I love a lot more than Persuasion, but I do think it's a wonderful book, and one I would highly recommend. At number 15 with 51 votes, we have Moby Dick by Herman Melville, which is a US novel from 1851, which is the story of a ship and a dramatic search for the whale that once bit off the captain's leg. I have not read Moby Dick, and I don't know that I ever will. I spoke about this in the video I made talking about The Guardian's top 100 best books, because they had Moby Dick on the list too. And every time I ever hear someone talk about Moby Dick, it sounds so fascinating and so like a book that I would find really interesting. But I have a phobia of fish. And I know whales aren't technically fish, but they are big fish if you have a phobia of fish. And I just don't know that I can handle a long book about whales with a lot of detail about whaling. Like, I'm just not sure I could get through it. At number 14, with 55 votes, we have East of Eden by John Steinbeck. This is a US novel from 1952, which I believe follows the intertwining lives of two families in California in the early 20th century. I have not read East of Eden. I mentioned John Steinbeck earlier when talking about The Grapes of Wrath. I have read 2 of his short books and nothing else, and I didn't really love them, so I don't know whether I will ever read anything more by John Steinbeck. Maybe people can recommend me what Steinbeck I should read if I didn't like The Pearl or Of Mice and Men at all. At number 13 with 57 votes, we have Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is a British novel from 1938. This is a really powerful gothic novel that I love very much. It follows a young woman, an unnamed narrator, who marries a man called Maxim de Winter, who's a bit older than her. And when she gets back to his grand estate of Manderley, she finds that the place is sort of haunted, metaphorically, by his first wife, Rebecca. It is a very tense, messy, dark book that I think is really interesting, and that I find especially interesting as a sort of like Jane Eyre retelling, or sort of like take on Jane Eyre. I think there's a lot of crossover between them, and as someone who loves Jane Eyre, I find Rebecca really interesting. I really liked Rebecca and I would highly recommend it. At number 12 with 59 votes, we have the final Charles Dickens novel on this list. It is Bleak House, which is a novel from 1853. Bleak House is the story of various characters who are all sort of brought together by a legal case called Jarndyce and Jarndyce, which has been going on for generations. It is a dispute over a will, who is to inherit this great fortune, and we follow various characters who are sort of connected to this. It's a really interesting, complex, powerful novel with a lot of fantastic characters. And also like a really interesting crime element to it, which I think is fascinating. It is told in a really distinctive style as well, a dual narrative between first person past tense and third person present tense. I think Bleak House is fantastic. While there are a couple of Dickens novels I love more than Bleak House, I think this being the highest Dickens on this list is pretty good. At number 11 with 59 votes also, we have Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, which is a French novel from 1862 that I love very much. I reread it earlier this this year, and it was wonderful to reread. It is a big, long novel following a lot of different characters with so many tangents, but I love the tangents and I love the story. I love the emotional intensity of it and the humour of it, and the incredible social criticism that runs throughout the book. Les Miserables tells a story of a man called Jean Valjean who early on in life is arrested for theft and spends 2 decades imprisoned before finally gaining some level of freedom. He tries to turn his life around and start again, and the book follows his relationship with his adopted daughter Cosette, as well as with 2 men, a police captain Javert and a criminal Thénardier, who he sort of encounters again and again over the course of his life, and who continue to sort of haunt him and keep his past haunting him. And it's just a fantastic book that is so emotionally intense and so beautiful, and I love it very, very much indeed. Okay, we're into the top 10. At number 10, with 65 votes, we have Emma by Jane Austen, a British novel from 1815. Emma is the story of Emma, who is handsome, clever and rich, and has lots of money and no reason to marry. She doesn't want to marry, she just wants to matchmake everyone around her. Emma is a wonderful, rich Jane Austen novel with a lot of complicated characters, with a really interesting sort of setting of this village of Highbury that Emma sort of rarely gets to leave, and it also has really, really interesting subplots. There's a lot going on beneath the surface of Emma, which I really love. At number 9, with 66 votes, we have The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, which is a French novel from 1846, and a really wonderful novel at that. This is a revenge tale, which tells the story of Edmond Dantès, who ends up imprisoned in the Bastille for something he didn't do, and later in life comes back into the world as the Count of Monte Cristo in order to get his revenge on the people who put him in prison. And it is just a fantastic revenge story. Like Les Miserables, it is a long book with a lot of tangents, but I love the tangents and I just loved every second of The Count of Monte Cristo. It is such a wonderful revenge story and such a wonderful like roller coaster of a book, and I just highly recommend it. At number 8, we have Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. This is a Russian novel from 1878, and this tells the story of various families, various unhappy families in Russia, focusing on Anna Karenina, who is unhappy with her husband and having an affair, and also 2 other characters, Kitty and Levin, and their sort of romantic story. It's a really powerful novel that I really loved. It's been a long time since I read it. It's not super fresh in my mind, but I did love it a lot, and I would highly, highly recommend it. At number 7, with 68 votes, we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which is a British novel from 1818 or from 1831. There was a revised edition. I don't know what edition people were voting for, but there we go. Frankenstein is a really powerful novel which tells the story of Victor Frankenstein, a man who plays God with technology and creates a person, a creature, out of the dead body parts of other people. But when this creature is created, Victor Frankenstein runs away and leaves the creature to fend for himself, and everything goes on from there. I think Frankenstein is fantastic. It's been a good decade since I last read it. I'd really like to reread it actually, but I think it is a really powerful, fascinating, interesting sort of gothic work of science fiction. It's such a interesting creation for the point in time it was created, and I just think it's incredible. At number 6, also with 68 votes, we have War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, a Russian novel from 1869. So 2 Tolstoy novels in the list, both in the top 10. War and Peace is a long, really interesting novel which looks at various families in the run-up to and during the 1812 invasion of Russia from France. I read War and Peace a few years ago now and really, really enjoyed it, though not as much as I enjoyed Anna Karenina. I think War and Peace is a fantastic novel with a lot of really, really interesting characters. There are a lot of people to keep track of, and I probably liked the peace bits more than the war bits, and I would say that Leo Tolstoy's like manner of tangents is less to my taste than Victor Hugo or Alexandre Dumas' manner of tangents, but I do think it's a great novel and I would highly recommend it. Okay, we're into the top 5, and there is a bit of a big jump up in vote numbers, especially for the top 3. So at number 5, with 85 votes, we have Middlemarch by George Eliot, a British novel from 1872. George Eliot is not my favourite writer. I really don't get on with her writing style, but she's one of those authors who I don't like but I do respect, and Middlemarch is one of those books that I don't like but I do respect. It's not a book I enjoyed because I don't get on with George Eliot's writing style, but but I can see that George Eliot is doing so many interesting things in it, and I can really understand why other people love it. Middlemarch tells the story of the provincial town of Middlemarch and various people within it. It is a novel about small towns, about community, about marriage, about the position of women in the 19th century. It's set in the 1830s, in the run-up to the 1832 Reform Bill, and that's an important part of the book. Like I said, not a personal favourite, but I understand why it is high up on this list. And number 4, with 95 votes, we have The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. A series of 3 books published between 1954 and 1955. J.R.R. Tolkien was a British writer, as I said earlier. I have not read The Lord of the Rings, which is another big gap in my reading. I feel like it's weird that I haven't read The Lord of the Rings, considering how much I love the films and the fact that I enjoy fantasy fiction, but I haven't. I would like to. I probably should do that at some point soon. The Lord of the Rings is kind of the foundation of the genre of fantasy in Western literature, I guess, and it's quite an important series that I should probably read at some point. The Lord of the Rings was one of the books that wasn't on the Guardian's list, and that a lot of people were surprised not to see on the Guardian's list. Okay, we're into the top 3 now, and these 3 have a lot of votes each. So at number 3, with 114 votes, we have Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, a British novel from 1847, and one of my personal favourite books of all time. Wuthering Heights is a wonderful novel, a wild, weird novel that tells the story of the Earnshaw family and the Linton family and the clashes between them in the wild moors of Yorkshire in the late 18th century. And it looks at what happens when a young orphan boy called Heathcliff comes into this world and disrupts everything. It is a revenge story, it is a gothic novel, it is a novel told with a frame narrative, with stories within stories, and so many layers of narrative unreliability. It is so clever and so layered and complex. I have read Wuthering Heights so many times, and every time I read it, I discover something new, and it's just wonderful. So I love Wuthering Heights a lot. Very glad to see it at number 3. At number 2, with 138 votes, we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, a British novel from 1848 by Emily's sister. Jane Eyre is another novel that I love very much. It is a novel that got me into Victorian literature and kind of like into reading as a hobby, I guess, as a teenager. Jane Eyre tells the story of Jane Eyre. We follow her unhappy childhood as an orphan, the rejection she gets from her aunt, her life at school, and what happens when she grows up and goes away to become a governess at a place called Thornfield Hall, working for a man called Mr. Rochester. It is a gothic novel, it is a love story, it is a coming-of-age story with wonderful characterization and so many fantastic moments. I love Jane Eyre so much. What a book it is. Then at number 1, with an incredible 168 votes, which means that a full third of the 508 people who entered this survey put this as one of their 10 best books of all time. At number 1, we have Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, a British novel from 1813, which is an incredible, very famous love story about a young woman called Elizabeth Bennet living with her 4 sisters and her parents, who meets a man called Mr. Darcy and doesn't like him at all until maybe she does. And it's interesting to see Pride and Prejudice in the number 1 spot with like a full 30 more votes than the number 2 book. I love Pride and Prejudice a lot. It is one of my favourite books of all time, and it is my most reread book, I think. I think it's overtaken Wuthering Heights now. I've read it many, many times. I read it most years. It is a huge comfort book for me, and I do think it is a perfect novel. I do think it is a perfect love story. And I just love it very, very much. So I'm very glad to see it as the number 1 book. So there we go. That is Booktube's best 100 novels of all time, as decided by a survey I ran. So, you know, as I said earlier, not necessarily Booktube's best books, but the people who watch this channel's choice of the best 100 books of all time. I have been filming for 2 hours. I think this video is going to be over an hour long, so I'm very sorry if it has been incredibly long. But I hope it has been interesting, and I hope this list is interesting. As I said, I'm going to try and publish the list as a sort of written document somewhere as well. This survey has been really fun to do, but it has, as I said, taken me a really long time to put the data together. As I forget to say, but should occasionally say on this channel, if you have enjoyed this video, if you enjoy my content, if you ever want to support me on Patreon or leave me a tip on Super Thanks, that would be really wonderful. Support on Patreon really helps me make more videos on this channel for free, and helps me make videos like this that are longer and require a lot more work. You know, some videos I make on this channel are probably about 3 hours of work, and this video is probably a good like 40 hours of work. Anyway, that's all for now. Please do let me know your thoughts down in the comments. That's all for now. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.